The forest had its own breath. By day, the woods of early Eastern Europe pulsed with life-chirping, buzzing, whispering under breezes that slipped through canopies like old songs. But when nightfall came, the entire world seemed to tilt. The trees stood stiller, the winds grew colder, and in the small clearings where Slavic tribes had built their wooden homes and thatched villages, the people began their slow preparations for sleep, as if entering a sacred ceremony. They lived closely with nature, not merely beside it. Each night was not just a transition into rest, but into another world, one threaded with invisible things, spirits, ancestors, omens, and memories. To sleep for them was to leave this world for a realm that needed guarding. And so, as twilight melted into shadows, the village began to change. Children were hushed with slow, circular gestures of their mothers' hands. Doors creaked shut, but were never locked. Locks offended the spirits, it was said. A hush fell not out of fear, but respect. For the early Slavs believed the forest didn't sleep at night, it only watched. At the edge of each homestead, just past the fire pits and woven fences, darkness waited. They called it the Nochnitsa zone, the space where the known world ended and the dream world began. Even the dogs behaved differently after sunset, staying closer, pacing with low growls as if sensing something the humans could not. And so began the ritual of sleep preparation. The fire was stoked low, not to cook, but to glow, soft enough to cast dancing shadows across wooden walls, bright enough to keep the darkest corners of the room visible. In these shadows, the elders said, spirits sometimes played, but only if they were invited gently. One quirky habit among many tribes was the use of ash circles. A member of the family, often the eldest daughter or grandmother, would draw a small circle of fireplace ash around the sleeping area. The act wasn't rushed. It was done with a flat palm and soft humming, as if waking up some dormant layer of protection. The ash was believed to confuse harmful spirits, making them go in circles until dawn, never reaching the sleeper soul. Outside the home, the village transformed in rhythm. Chickens were gently ushered into their coops, not chased. Livestock pens were reinforced with bundles of dried lavender or wormwood plants believed to carry calming energy. Even the simple act of sweeping the front step before nightfall was done with precision, always in 3 short strokes inward, never outward, so as not to sweep the soul away. But it wasn't just ritual, there was strategy. The forest, beautiful and green by day, could turn treacherous in moonlight. Wolves, wild boars, and thieves didn't follow schedules. Sleep in the early Slavic tribes was therefore protected. This was not a world of unlocked security and quiet suburbs. These were villages nestled deep in the veins of ancient wilderness, where sleep could not be taken for granted, and so sentries were chosen. Each night, as firelight dimmed and heads lay upon simple straw-filled pillows, 1 or 2 villagers would take the role of threshold keepers, not soldiers, not guards, but watchers. They sat silently near doorways or facing the darkest side of the forest line, often with no weapon in hand, just a wooden staff and an oiled lamp. Their job wasn't to fight, it was to witness, to keep the barrier between the sleeping world and the waking one stable. Sometimes they sang, but very softly. Other times they tapped their staffs against the ground in a gentle rhythm that carried like a heartbeat across the slumbering huts. These sounds were said to lull the soul as much as the body. Sleep in this world was not absence, it was presence somewhere else. And yet, for all its structure and careful protection, not every night followed the same script. One quirky belief shared across several Slavic groups was that the first person to yawn after nightfall would determine the quality of dreams for the entire household. A bad yawn too loud, too quick, or done with a grimace was believed to bring choppy, unpleasant sleep. A soft yawn paired with closed eyes and a stretch invited calming dreams. In this way, yawning itself became a bit of a ritual. They watched one another closely after sunset. When someone finally let out the night's first yawn, others would mimic it gently, as if anchoring themselves to the same dream path. There was no laughter in this. It was taken seriously, ritual disguised as reflex. There was also a belief that certain nights of the month held more dream power than others. On the waxing crescent, dreams were considered builders. They showed you what to aim for. On the waning moon, they were cleaners meant to release pain. On the full moon, however, many didn't sleep at all. Instead, they waited. The night of a full moon was a kind of unsleep, where some villagers would sit quietly by the river or high on hillocks, watching the sky for signs. They didn't fear dreams on this night, but they knew them to be stronger, more vivid, sometimes too real. But for now, on most nights, the villagers lay close together under fur or linen or, in warmer months, nothing but tightly woven blankets. They lay not in silence, but in murmurs. Prayers were rarely spoken aloud. Instead, they were hummed or whispered in clusters of 3 words, an old pattern believed to echo how spirits spoke in threes. And when sleep finally came, it came not as escape, but as crossing. The wind outside rustled the thatch. A distant owl called once, then again, and inside all was still. The watchers did not blink often. They sat still near doorways or at the edges of the village paths, draped in thick cloaks of wool or fur, their silhouettes nearly lost in the dark. These were not warriors in the typical sense. They carried no swords, no shields, just staffs carved with symbols, sometimes faint runes passed down through generations, and small clay jars of smoldering herbs to keep their minds sharp and the spirits soothed. The early Slavic tribes believed that as the sun sank behind the treetops, a boundary between worlds thinned. There were no clear lines in this belief, no sharp dichotomy between real and unreal. To them, sleep was not only a biological necessity, but a form of travel. And like any journey, it required guardians at the gate. These guardians, called pragodniki, or threshold keepers in some dialects, were more spiritual than militant. Most were older men or women, people who had outlived wars, winters, and wandering. They were chosen not for strength, but for steadiness. A threshold keeper was expected to remain alert for hours, watching over the home from dusk to dawn, guiding the household through its slumber the way a boatman guides a ferry across a darkened lake. It wasn't just external threats they watched for. There were beliefs about spirits who traveled at night domovoi, house spirits who guarded or troubled a family depending on how they were treated navki, the souls of the restless dead or even leshi, the forest spirits known to wander closer to human dwellings during heavy fog or moonless nights. To prevent these entities from crossing into the home, the pragodnik would scatter dried rowan berries near doorsteps. Rowan was thought to carry a red energy that confused malevolent spirits. Sometimes they used strands of woven horsehair tied into small, complex knot stokens believed to trap a spirit long enough for it to forget its purpose. One strange but consistent habit among many tribes was the use of spirit shoes. Before bedtime, families placed tiny handmade slippers, often no more than thumb length, near their doors. These were not toys. They were offerings, meant for any spirit that might wander in uninvited. The belief was simple: if a spirit found footwear waiting, it would be pleased, slip the shoes on, and quietly leave without disturbing anyone. It sounds like a child's tale. But to these villagers, every custom, no matter how small, was rooted in survival. In a world without locks or alarms, these quiet gestures were a kind of emotional architecture, a structure of belief to make sense of the dark. Inside, sleepers trusted the watchers completely. The home itself was considered sacred ground, especially at night. Each family's hearth was the beating heart of the structure, never fully extinguished, always glowing just enough to cast a warm orange on the floor and walls. Parents tucked their children in close, with older siblings placed on the outer edges of the group, a subtle and protective layering. Those who watched did not speak, but sometimes they hummed. They used melodies older than words slow, looping refrains passed down from mothers to sons and fathers to daughters. These songs weren't lullabies in the traditional sense. They weren't meant to put people to sleep. They were meant to guide them once they were asleep, like gentle signposts in a fog. A particularly curious practice involved a small carved item called a zvonokam. This was a piece of bone or wood, often the size of a walnut, with tiny holes drilled in a spiral pattern. Inside, seeds or pebbles were sealed. If shaken gently, it made a faint rattling, not sharp or loud, but subtle, almost like a dry whisper. Threshold keepers would use this object if they sensed something was wrong in the night, if the fire cracked too loud or an animal stirred strangely. The sound was believed to remind the spirit world that the home was protected, gently nudging intrusions away without provocation. Perhaps most intriguing of all were the watchers' faces. They bore no sternness, no suspicion. Instead, they watched with serenity, as if knowing that most things that passed in the night meant no harm, just curiosity. They didn't aim to defeat anything. Their goal was to balance the line between worlds. Sometimes, just before dawn, they would scatter grain or salt at the threshold, one final offering to ensure the safe return of all dreams. For it was believed that when one slept, the soul stepped out and wandered. And it was the watcher's job not only to keep bad things out, but to make sure the dreaming soul could find its way back in. In some households, a small flat stone was placed near the door. On it, just before sleep, the dreamer would press a finger. This was called the anchor stone, a gentle symbol, but powerful. It told the soul where to return. Some believed it worked like a kind of beacon in the spirit world, glowing brighter the longer the sleeper remained at rest. It was in these quiet details that the beauty of Slavic sleep rituals revealed itself, not in drama, but in rhythm. The watchers continued their vigil into the last hours of night, even as the moon sagged low and dew collected on rooftops. They sat in silence. They breathed in smoke. They nodded to each other across walkways. And when their shift was over, they did not collapse into beds. They slept near the door, curled on mats of rush and straw, as if still keeping watch even in slumber. Because even in sleep, the threshold was never left alone. Their beds were never just beds. In the early Slavic villages, what passed for bedding would seem austere by modern standard spiles of straw, thin mats made of woven reeds, or sometimes layered animal skins spread over packed earth or wooden planks. Yet for the Slavs, these humble sleeping spaces carried meaning far beyond comfort. They were constructed with thought, with ritual, and always with the awareness that sleep was a journey that required gentle preparation. Each evening before lying down, the sleeping area was woken. Not in a literal sense, of course, but in the symbolic language of the tribe. The bedding was shaken and fluffed not only to release insects or dust, but to disturb any lingering energy that might have become trapped in the fibers during the day. To the early Slavs, energy could cling to objects just as it did to people, and the bed needed to be cleared like a slate before dreams could begin. Straw was the most common material used for mattresses, gathered in bundles and refreshed seasonally. But it wasn't left plain. Women often mixed in dried herbs and flowers, lavender, mugwort, wild thyme, or crushed poppy petals. These weren't chosen for their smell alone, though the scents were calming. Each had a purpose. Mugwort, for instance, was believed to open the mind's eye and encourage prophetic dreams. Poppy was used for stillness, for peace, and lavender, believed to calm angry spirits, was always placed at the corners of the bedding, forming an invisible dream net. Then came the smoke. Before sleep, families would light small bundles of herbs, sometimes wrapped in bark, or held together with strips of linen. These smudge bundles weren't waved around like incense. Instead, they were gently placed in small clay bowls or carved wooden trays at the foot of the bed. The smoke would rise slowly, curling through the air, and mingle with the breath of the sleepers. This smoke was not simply about scent. It was meant to soften the barrier between worlds. The Slavs believed that smoke was a traveler, capable of moving between realms. By allowing it to drift over the sleeping body, it could carry away, unrestore, in rare cases, bring messages back. It was common for families to pass these bundles through the firelight before placing them down. Fire was not only warmth, but witness. It purified, yes, but it also remembered. And letting the herbs see the fire before they smoked was a way of sharing their purpose with the spirit world. Each bed had its own story. Some were built with care into corners of homes where the walls met at protective angles known as quiet corners. Others were placed near windows, where moonlight could wash over the sleepers and supposedly draw away lingering pain or sorrow from the previous day. One curious belief held by many Slavic families was the idea of the mirror bed. A simple mirror, usually a reflective piece of metal or polished stone, was hidden beneath the bed or hung just above it. The purpose was not vanity. It was protection. Mirrors were believed to trap malevolent dreams. If a nightmare approached, it would see its own reflection and turn away in confusion. These beds were not large or luxurious, but they were sacred. Each member of the household had a place, and those places were respected. Even in households with many children, there was an order to the sleeping arrangement, an invisible map drawn from birthright, emotion, and intuition. The eldest child often slept closest to the wall, a position of honor and trust. The youngest, in the crook of the mother's arm, protected by warmth. In winter, entire families bundled together under fur blankets or woven cloth, creating shared warmth, shared breath, shared dreams. One unusual practice, especially in highland tribes, was the use of sleep stones. Smooth river stones, warmed by the fire, were wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. But these weren't just for warmth. People whispered to the stones. Not long speeches, just fragments of memory. "May I find my brother in my dream," one might say. Or "let me forget the sorrow of the field." The idea was that the stone would carry the message as it cooled, releasing it slowly into the dream space. In more remote villages, certain families used wooden bowls of water placed under the bed. Floating on the surface were petals, usually from calendula or chamomile, and sometimes slivers of bark. If the petals clustered in the morning, it was considered a sign that the dreamer's soul had traveled far and needed gentler waking. If they spread widely, it meant the dreams had been light and local. Of course, not all rituals were communal. Some individuals, especially older women, preferred to sleep alone and created intricate personal sleep spaces. These were often surrounded by baskets filled with dried herbs, bones, bits of woven cloth, or fragments of pottery. Each item was thought to carry a dream, or perhaps guard against one. These women were sometimes called spachka, vedmi loosely translated as dream witches, though not in a pejorative way. They were respected, even feared slightly, for their relationship with the sleeping world. The most peculiar of all rituals was the practice of singing to the bed itself. In some regions, especially among mountain-dwelling tribes, the bed was treated as a kind of spirit being. Before lying down, the head of the household would murmur a lullaby not to their children, but to the bed. "Sleep, old branch," one version went, "sleep soft and safe. Cradle my bones until the sun returns." To an outsider, this might seem eerie, but to the early Slavs, it was comfort. The bed was not just an object, it was a boat, a raft to carry the soul across night's river. And like any vessel, it needed tending, words, and warmth to do its work. And so, the beds were readied. The smoke curled gently through the beams, and slowly, the sleepers sank not into oblivion, but into another kind of living. When the moon hung low and pale and the village was steeped in a silence so deep it seemed to hum, there was one ritual that shimmered quietly on the edge of belief: the midnight bath. Rare and rarely spoken aloud, this custom belonged mostly to the older traditions, and especially to those who lived near clean streams or forest springs. It wasn't for cleanliness, at least not of the body. It was a cleansing of the self, the intangible layers thought to accumulate worry, restlessness, and invisible burdens that could poison a dream if left unresolved. Not everyone participated. It wasn't expected. It wasn't required. And in truth, it was more often the realm of the thoughtful, the troubled, or the dream-sensitive. Those who bathed at midnight were often those who had endured a loss, or who woke too often in a cold sweat, unable to recall what had startled them. The ritual was always solitary. No one ever joined. That was part of its weight. Wrapped in woven linen or wool cloaks, the participant would leave their home shortly before midnight. If the village had a spring or sacred pool, that's where they would go. If not, a quiet corner of a stream where reeds grew tall and whispering would suffice. Once there, they would kneel by the water, rarely immersing themselves entirely. Instead, they would dip their hands, cup the water, and let it fall over their head, chest, and shoulders. The motion was slow and deliberate, each splash a kind of release, each drop a thread in a silent conversation with the unseen. Before the water touched the skin, a single word or wish was often whispered into the surface. Peace. Let go. No more visions. The word would drift with the ripples and then disappear beneath. One quirky part of the practice was the use of moon-reflected water. The participant would wait until the moon's reflection was fully visible in the pool, and then gather water only from that luminous patch. It was believed that the moonlight purified what the eye couldn't see, turning the water into a kind of liquid mirror to cleanse the soul's residue. Some people wore garlands of night-blooming flowers during the ritual, particularly those who had lost a loved one that year. The flowers weren't meant to honor the dead, but to cradle the living in scent and memory. The petals would be let loose into the stream afterward, allowed to drift away with the currents, as though carrying burdens far from home. In colder seasons, the ritual changed. Full immersion was impossible, and water drawn indoors was said to lose its power. So instead, snow was gathered by the handful soft, clean drifts taken before sunrise. The snow would be melted by the hearth in a dark clay bowl, and the water used the same way to bathe the forehead, heart, and palms. This snow water was thought to contain the memory of the forest, silent and pure, captured in cold stillness. One legend told of a woman who bathed in melted snow each night for a full cycle of the moon. On the 30th day, she no longer dreamed in her own language. Her dreams came in symbols, in colors that hummed, in feelings that hung in the air long after she woke. She was said to be the first snoviditsa, a dream seer, and generations later, her lineage was still known for strange sleep habits and visions. The practice of the midnight bath was not confined to grief or pain. Some did it as part of preparation for weddings, for harvest festivals, or after the naming of a child. It was said that one could wash away not only what had clung too tightly, but also make room for what was yet to arrive. Notably, no one ever asked another if they had gone to the bath. It was understood as private, like a confession whispered into water. If someone saw you returning with damp hair and quiet steps, they might nod, or offer you a warm stone to hold. But no words would pass. That, too, was part of the ritual's protection. The water itself was respected, even feared slightly. Certain springs were said to see things. You could bathe in them, but you could not drink. Others had stories wrapped around them of young men who disappeared in their reflections, or of songs heard beneath the surface when no wind stirred the trees. These tales weren't warnings exactly. They were reminders that even peace required reverence. In some villages, a single flat rock was used as the standing stone for those who bathed at night. Worn smooth by countless bare feet, this stone absorbed the fears and hopes of dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. Before each new season, the stone was washed by the elder women using spruce needles and ash water, and then left alone until it dried. No one touched it during that time. It was cleansing itself. One strangely charming belief was that owls approved of the ritual. If an owl hooted once during the bath, it was said to be a sign the soul was clean. Twice meant the sleeper would see visions. 3 times, however, was a gentle warning: stay home the next night. The path between worlds was open too wide. The midnight bath may have faded with time washed away by new faiths and new habits, but even today, in some rural parts of Eastern Europe, old families still pass down a phrase, clean water, clear dreams. And sometimes, when the moon is just right, you can still see a figure by the stream, quiet, slow, not afraid of the dark. They're not washing dirt. They're washing the weight of waking. The fire had long gone quiet, but its glow remained, a pulsing ember light that painted soft orange halos on the walls of the hut. Most had already drifted into the deep places of sleep, but in one corner, an elder sat upright, staring into the slow dance of coals. Her lips moved without sound, and though no one else stirred, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. This was the hour of the lullaby for the ancestors. Among the early Slavic tribes, the boundary between the living and the dead was seen not as a wall, but as a veil, thin, shimmering, and occasionally lifted by those who knew how to ask gently. As part of their sleep tradition, some elders practiced the quiet ritual of speaking to the departed before letting their bodies rest. Not mourning, not longing, but remembering, deliberate, careful remembrance that bridged time and softened sorrow. The lullaby was not a song in the usual sense. It had no formal melody, no repeated lines. It was more like a whispered listing names, places, moments. The names of those who had passed, spoken slowly into the firelight. One name per breath, then silence, then another name. Sometimes it was only a few parents, a sibling, a child. Other times it went on for nearly an hour, trailing off only when the speaker's voice gave way to sleep. The fire became the listener. It flickered as if reacting, shadows curling around the speaker like warm breath. The belief was simple and deeply rooted. If the dead were remembered, they would keep the dreams safe. One peculiar version of this practice involved tiny tokens called pamiat kismal items made of wood or thread or pressed seeds. Each represented someone lost, often carried in a pouch tied to the sleeper's wrist or ankle. Before bed, the elder would hold the pouch, speak the names once, and then tuck it close beneath the straw bedding. In some households, these were kept for generations, gradually filled with more tokens until they could no longer close. The ritual varied slightly between tribes. Some lit a second, smaller fire beside the hearth called the spirit light, meant to draw any wandering souls closer, like moths to a flame. Others offered bits of bread or dried berries, placed in a simple wooden bowl and left on the windowsill until morning. These offerings weren't consumed, at least not by the living. If they remained undisturbed, it was considered a good omen. The ancestors had come and gone peacefully. An especially rare but beautiful variant was practiced by a few forest-dwelling clans, where the elder would place a pine branch under the bed and whisper stories into it. These weren't just memories, they were narratives, tales of the harvest, of a child's first steps, of a bird seen flying oddly against the wind. The branch would later be burned, usually on the new moon, sending the stories into the ether for the ancestors to hear. One quirky but oddly moving belief was that ancestors could hear better when spoken to beside fire than by water. Fire, it was said, crackled like their bones once did. Water carried things away too quickly. So even in summer, when fires were not needed for warmth, the lullaby ritual required at least a candle, a smoldering coal, or a bowl of glowing pitch. For those who had no living memory of their ancestors, orphans, wanderers, the adopted, there was a different kind of lullaby. They would speak to the unknown bones, a respectful phrase for the forgotten dead. Their lullabies were more abstract, often shaped like prayers to time itself. Whoever stood before me, I remember your breath. Whoever loved before me, I carry your echo. This practice served a dual purpose. It soothed the sleeper, yes, but it also grounded them. The early Slavs were people of continuity, of layered memory. Dreams were not for fantasy alone, they were considered spaces where the past could speak. In one tale passed between fires for generations, a woman named Vedana lost her husband during a hunting accident in winter. Every night afterward, she whispered his name into the flames. Years passed. One evening, she dreamt of a stag covered in frost, who lowered his head and spoke with her husband's voice, "You are almost done naming me. I'm ready to sleep now." She never said his name again after that, and she never woke troubled. For some, this was the goal, not to hold on forever, but to say the names just long enough for peace to return. Children were taught to listen for these whisperings, but not to repeat them. The names of the dead were sacred sounds, not to be thrown about like ordinary words. It was common for children to drift to sleep in their mother's laps, the lullaby murmuring quietly just out of reach, like a boat fading into mist. Even pets seemed to respond. Dogs would settle more quickly. Cats would curl beside the fire, their ears flicking toward the sound as if they too remembered someone. In springtime, the lullaby sometimes changed. Rather than names, the elders would murmur blessings, asking the ancestors to watch over the growing seeds, the pregnant livestock, the newly built roof. They called these the planting lullabies, and they were said to bring dreams of green fields and calm weather. Perhaps the strangest part of the ritual, though, was what came after. Once the names were said, the elder would turn their back to the fire, not rudely, not dismissively, just slowly, with care. It was the final gesture, like closing a door gently without making a sound. Then, and only then, did they lie down. Sleep came quietly, as it always did, and the fire continued to burn low, its light carrying the names into the night air. By the time most villagers had fallen into dreams, when the embers had shrunk to orange eyes blinking sleepily in their hearths, a different kind of person stirred softly beneath the covers. The Slavs called them snovitsi dreamwalkers. These were not priests, nor warriors, nor seers in the usual sense. They were quiet souls, known more for their patience than their power. Dreamwalkers were thought to move differently through sleep, not drifting passively but journeying, learning, and returning with impressions too strange for waking words. Some believed they were chosen by birth. Others thought it was a matter of sensitivity, a heart too open, a mind too porous, a soul too quick to wander. But all agreed these dreamers saw more than others. It began in childhood. A dream walker might wake with knowledge they could not explain that the neighbor's cow would give birth that day, or that a thunderstorm was hiding behind the next moon. Some had vivid memories of things no one remembered teaching them a melody known only to the deceased, or the location of an object lost for years. Rather than fear these children, many families treated them with a blend of caution and reverence. They were not always comforted after nightmares. Instead, they were asked gently, always gently, what they saw. Were there hills? Was the moon broken? Did you follow the bird, or did it follow you? These were not idle questions. Over time, patterns would emerge, symbols that seemed to cross from one dreamwalker to another, even across villages. The raven with 3 eyes, the woman with silver hands, the bridge made of sleepwalker's breath. None of these were spoken of during the day. They were shared at night, near hearths, under hushed tones, when only the trees and stars could hear. The stars played a key role in the dreamwalker's life. While most villagers used constellations for farming and travel, dreamwalkers studied them as a kind of map not of places, but of possibilities. They believed certain dreams could only be had under specific star patterns. The dreaming brain, they said, tilted its doors open depending on the sky. Some even created crude star mirrors, bowls of water placed outside to reflect the heavens while they slept nearby. The idea was that by capturing a piece of the night sky in a still pool, one could invite a particular kind of vision. It wasn't science. It was faith draped in ritual. One curious practice among dreamwalkers was the sleep belt accord or sash made from wool and birch fibers, tied loosely around the waist before bed. Symbols were sometimes embroidered into it with bone needle shapes known only to a few. The belt was believed to keep the soul tethered, ensuring it would return safely from its night wandering. Some even added tiny bells that made no sound, but were thought to ring in the dream world, alerting guardians that the sleeper came in peace. Dreamwalkers weren't always at peace, though. There were accounts rare and solemn of those who didn't wake. Their bodies remained still, breathing, yet unreachable. Elders would sit by these sleepers and hum lullabies not to soothe them, but to coax them back. If the sleeper eventually stirred, they would often wake with wide eyes and refuse to speak for days. These were called deep walkers, and though few became them, all who dreamwalked feared the possibility. A quirk of the dreamwalker community was their affinity for stones. Flat stones in particular, warmed by the sun during the day, then slipped under the bedding at night. They weren't chosen randomly. Dreamwalkers would search riverbeds for hours, turning over pebbles until they felt one vibrate ever so slightly in the palm. These were called kamni svidenia stones of meeting. Some believed these stones acted like keys. Others said they were doorways. None truly knew. But they were guarded closely, passed down carefully, and never spoken of in daylight. Though dreamwalking was deeply personal, it was not isolating. Once a year, usually during the longest night of winter, dreamwalkers from nearby villages would gather. They called it the Noknoi Zov, the night calling. Around great fires, they would share only one dream each, just one, and then listen, eyes half closed as others spoke theirs. No arguments, no judgments, just quiet nods and shared stillness. Some say the fires that night burned blue. Others say they made no smoke at all. One old tale tells of a dreamwalker named Radomir, who slept for 7 days straight after claiming to have seen the first dream ever dreamed by man. When he finally woke, his hair had turned white and he could no longer speak. But each night afterward, villagers said, he would point to a different star in the sky, never the same one twice, and hum a tune no one could remember in the morning. What separated dreamwalkers most from others was their relationship with fear. They did not resist nightmares. They entered them, slow and curious, believing that even the most terrifying dreams carried messages. A burning tree? Perhaps it meant a broken promise. A mouthful of ash? Maybe too many words left unsaid. But always they tried to return before sunrise. For the sun was not friendly to the dream's memory. It erased, it scattered, it made soft images feel foolish. And so they woke in the dim hours, scribbling images into bark, murmuring symbols into clay, or sometimes simply sitting in silence until their breath steadied again. The rest of the village never asked. They had their own dreams to chase, their own sleep to protect. But they made space for the dreamwalkers, gave them the corners closest to moonlight, listened without listening when fragments slipped out in conversation. Because even if they didn't dream like that themselves, they knew somewhere deep in their bones that the dreamwalkers were not only wandering for themselves, they walked for everyone. The night was not entirely silent in early Slavic villages, even when the fires dimmed and the watchers dozed with heads bowed. There were sounds that lingered, rustlings from thatched rooftops, the soft murmurs of wind through birch leaves, the faint creaking of wood as homes settled deeper into the earth. But none of these stirred the sleepers as quickly or as fearfully as a voice. Not a scream, not a cry, just a voice in the quiet. That's why the Silence Pact existed. Among many tribes, especially those living near dense forests or swamps, it was a deeply held belief that one must never speak aloud after waking in the night. Not a whisper, not a name, not even a startled "what was that?" For in the hush of dark hours, words were thought to attract attention from things that did not belong to the world of the waking. It wasn't so much a fear of ghosts or ghouls. The danger lay in the possibility that something else was listening. The Silence Pact was first taught to children as a game. Parents would tell them gently, "If you can stay silent until the rooster sings, you win the night." But behind the game was a thread of ancient caution, stitched deeply into tradition. Breaking the pact could confuse the spirits or worse, invite them inside. Those who woke from a bad dream were told to place a hand over their mouth and hum softly into their palm. The gesture was symbolic, a sign to any lingering presence that the dreamer was still between worlds and not ready to speak with either side. Only at sunrise, when birds began to sing, could the silence be lifted. One peculiar extension of this belief was the morning window rule. If you spoke before seeing the sky, even just a greeting or yawned words, it was said to trap the last pieces of your dream in your chest. You'd carry that heaviness with you all day, unable to remember the dream, yet unable to forget its shadow. To help avoid this, many families hung lightweight cloths or carved wood panels in front of windows, opening them with ceremony only after the fire was relit and water had been splashed on the face. Light first, voice second. But the Silence Pact was more than superstition. It was also a tool. In households with many people, elders, parents, children, sometimes even guests, all sleeping in close quarters, the pact created a sacred bubble of rest, a way to preserve the hush, the softness, the shared warmth of nighttime breath. Breaking it risked not only spiritual danger, but practical discomfort. One word, one shout, could pull the whole household from its journey through dreams. Some went even further. In remote forest settlements, families crafted what they called Taishani camnestones of silence. These small palm-sized rocks were painted with symbols of night moons, stars, owls, and once in a while a human mouth with no teeth or tongue. These were placed beside the sleeping mat. If someone woke in fear or confusion, they would press the stone to their lips and hold it there until calm returned. The action was grounding. It told the body it was still in the dream's shadow but safe, that the world had not changed, only softened. In some households, sleep-talking was considered a dangerous breach, not always punishable, but always notable. Children who mumbled in their sleep were often moved to sleep beside a parent or grandparent, so their words could be monitored and, if necessary, answered with touch instead of voice. One legend told of a girl who whispered a spirit's name in her sleep for 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, the door opened by itself. No one was harmed, but every adult in the household began to wear small bells on their wrists at night, just in case something came to listen again. A charming, if strange, practice emerged in some coastal Slavic communities, where people tied dried reeds together in little bundles and placed them under the tongue if they woke too early. This was believed to soak up any accidental words before they could leave the mouth. Even if no one truly believed in its power anymore, it became habita gesture of care, of tradition, of quiet resilience. Children internalized the pact with surprising ease. Some even bragged about how long they could remain silent after waking. I stayed quiet until the 3rd crow of the rooster, one might whisper proudly during breakfast. It became a measure of maturity, of dream control, of growing up within the web of tradition that kept night sacred. Adults observed it too, but often in subtler ways. A glance exchanged over a flickering morning flame, a nod toward the one who woke earliest, a shared understanding that something had been carried through the night and released without needing to be named. And then, there were the exceptions. When illness struck, or a child cried in fear, the silence pact was broken without shame. The comfort of voice took precedence. But even then, the words spoken were chosen carefully rounded sounds, soft consonants, sentences that ended like lullabies rather than commands. Shh, little one. It was only the wind. Go back to the warm. The dream will wait. No one shouted in the night unless they were truly afraid, and when they did, the rest of the village would feel Ida tug on the thread that ran from home to home, soul to soul. Some families kept a journal of dreams but only wrote in it after sunrise. Until then, all memories were preserved in silence, as if too delicate to be handled by waking voices. Perhaps the most mysterious belief tied to the pact was this: that dreams, when left unspoken, would finish themselves in the following night. Words cut them off too soon. Silence let them bloom fully. And so, the pact endured. Not because it was enforced, but because it worked. In that deep velvet hush that blanketed the village after midnight, sleep was protected not by stone walls or sharpened tools, but by quiet. A silence woven through generations, kept alive by memory, by discipline, and by trust. Somewhere between the third and fourth hour of night, what elders called the bend of the dark, there was a moment so delicate, so finely balanced, that even the dogs outside would stop shifting in their sleep. It was in this thin hour that the Slavs believed dreams could become real. Not in the sense of bodies leaving beds or visions walking through doors, but in something quieter, the soft merging of dream symbols with waking signs. The practice to honor this was called Novetny znak, the nightly sign. It began with observation. If someone woke, even briefly during this hour, they would scan the room, taking note of what they saw, heard, or felt in the stillness. A cold draft across the face, the creak of a board, a spark from the hearth-all could be part of the message, for it was believed that in these small moments, the dream had not fully left yet. It lingered in the corners. It might even try to speak. The Novetny znak wasn't about control, it was about receptiveness. Those who paid attention learned to read the signs, often noting how sensations from the real world braided themselves into the dream world and back again. A child might dream of floating down a river only to wake and find their blanket bunched at their feet. An elder might dream of thunder just as the wind lifted a corner of the roof skin. These weren't coincidences, not in Slavic belief. They were bridges, and to notice them was to honor them. The recognition of these bridges often led to another tradition, the turning pillow. If one woke during a dream and sensed it wasn't yet finished, they would flip their pillow over cool side down and return their head to rest. This gesture wasn't just for comfort. It was symbolic, an invitation for the dream to continue. Some whispered a word into the fabric zavershi, complete it, before closing their eyes again. And remarkably, many believed it worked. Dreams resumed where they left off, sometimes taking on a more vivid clarity after the flip. In some families, children were taught never to speak aloud about pillow dreams, as they were considered dreams of the second gate too fragile for the coarse world of daytime talk. Beyond the pillow was the touchstone ritual. Kept beneath the bedding or near the hearth was a smooth, flat stone, often carried for years and infused with the sleeper's essence. Upon waking at the bend of the dark, one would place a hand on the stone and whisper only a single word, the essence of the dream, reduced to its root. Lost. Return. River. Begin. This word was not to be remembered by the conscious mind. It was meant for the dream, a final tether sent back across the divide. Those who practiced this often swore that their following nights became richer, more vivid, sometimes even predictive. The Novetny znak wasn't always gentle, though. Some woke with a sense of pressure on the chest or a tingle in the limbs, sensations thought to be signs of a dream struggling to anchor itself in the body. In these cases, a counter gesture was used, pulling the blanket up fully over the head, creating a small cave of warmth and breath. Inside this soft pocket, the dreamer could hum a single note, held softly in the throat. This was believed to seal the dream inside, like closing a jar over fireflies. It wasn't about analysis, it was about preservation. A curious variant of this practice emerged in swamp-bound villages, where people tied bundles of dried reeds and bird feathers to their bedposts. These charms, called Soni Vetra dream winds, were believed to catch any dreams that escaped and hold them until morning. If someone woke feeling hollow or forgetful, they would lightly shake the charm and breathe deeply beside it. Some claimed the dream would come flooding back, though never in the same order. There were even dream duels of a sort. In some areas, two sleepers would intentionally try to share a dream. Before sleep, they would hold hands for a full minute in silence, then part ways without speaking. If either woke during the bend of the dark, they were to touch the firewood and think only of the other person's face. The next morning, if both remembered the same symbol, a bird, a red cloak, a crumbling tower, it was considered proof. But not all dreams were meant to be remembered. Sometimes, waking in this fragile hour meant the dream was asking to be released. In those cases, the dreamer would rise quietly, step outside, and place a single toe on bare earth, no shoes, no speech, no looking up. This was the earth return, a ritual that allowed the dream to seep back into the soil, to be shared with the roots and stones rather than carried in the body. Some believed that when these dreams returned to the land, they could be picked up by animals. Dogs would bark at shadows, horses would shiver at noon. But the land knew what to do with such burdens. It always had. There was a final custom whispered among the oldest sleepers. If one woke and found a tear on their cheek, they were not to wipe it. Instead, they were to press it into their palm, close their hand, and let it dry there. In the morning, they would wash that hand with warmed milk and herb water, believing that the dream had touched something too deep for words, something sacred. This, too, was part of Navetny's Znak, the belief that the deepest dreams don't tell stories. They leave imprints. And so, in the bend of the dark, the village breathed in tandem. Some stirred, some shifted, a few sat up with knowing eyes. But all honored the stillness. All listened. For in that hour, the boundary between dream and world was not a wall. It was a breath. Not every night was meant for deep dreaming. Some were quieter, more hollow, and the early Slavs believed these were gifts, 2 nights for rest, not visions. On such nights, people embraced a ritual known simply as the blank night. It was not spoken of often, nor taught directly. Instead, it was learned through observation, through watching how elders slowed their breath, how they chose not to stir the fire, how they folded their dreams inward like closing a book without finishing the last page. The blank night was rooted in the understanding that not all dreaming was good. Sometimes the mind needed a pause, a clean page, a space between stories. Signs that a blank night was coming were subtle, a change in the air's toneless sharp, more humid, a quiet among the animals, a sense that the stars themselves had softened, grown distant. If the moon was veiled in clouds, or the wind moved sideways through the trees, it was often taken as confirmation. On such nights, rather than prepare the bed with herbs or dreamstones, the sleeper would remove all symbolic objects, mirror pieces, talismans, bundles of dried reed. The space was left bare, just the bedding, the sleeper, and the quiet. The ritual began with a gesture known as covering the eyes. The sleeper would take a strip of soft linen and gently lay it across their eyes, never tied, only placed. It blocked out the flickering of embers, the shimmer of stars, but more importantly, it told the body, "Tonight, we go nowhere." Unlike other rituals that invited the soul to travel, the blank night was about stillness. Inaction was its own form of care. Some sleepers, particularly elders and those who dreamed too often or too intensely, welcomed the blank nights with relief. They would even signal it beforehand, walking the perimeter of their home just once, barefoot, at dusk. Then they would enter in silence, not speaking another word until morning. Interestingly, certain plants were avoided on blank nights. Mugwort, poppy, and thymeal herbs that stirred the subconscious were not kept near the bed. Instead, calming herbs like oat straw or chamomile might be steeped in water and set near the hearth, but never inhaled directly. The goal was not sedation, it was neutrality. Families understood the unspoken rule: if someone was preparing for a blank night, no questions were asked. Children were taught not to tug the blankets of an adult resting in this state. Lovers did not reach for each other. Even the dogs were said to sense the shift, curling at a respectful distance. To dream during a blank night was seen as an imbalance, a slip of the mind's grasp. And though it couldn't always be avoided, those who experienced it were quiet in the morning, careful not to speak of what they saw. One odd tradition persisted in swampy regions. If someone dreamed on a blank night, they would rise before sunrise and place a handful of dirt beneath their tongue for 3 breaths. This, they believed, would absorb the leftover dream and prevent it from following them into the day. No one ever asked where that belief came from. It was just done, solemnly. The next day, such sleepers would sit near moving water or tall grass, letting the morning sounds rinse through them. Words were kept to a minimum. Instead of speaking, people would hum or whistle softly, simple, repetitive tunes passed down over generations. Not lullabies, but not entirely unlike them. The concept of blank nights extended into larger cycles too. Some believed there were blank seasons periods when the village itself was not meant to dream deeply. These usually occurred in the lead-up to great changes, harvests, weddings, deaths, or migrations. During these times, dreamstones were buried, charms were wrapped in cloth and hidden, and fires were allowed to burn lower than usual. The silence deepened. What made the blank night unique among sleep rituals was that it had no story, no lore, no mythical origin. It was, in a sense, anti-lore, a space not to fill but to leave open. Yet one custom survived in nearly every tribe: the morning breath. When waking from a blank night, one was to sit up slowly, take a single deep breath, and exhale toward the window or door, never inward, never toward another person. This exhale was said to carry the stillness out, releasing it gently into the world so that it didn't settle in the chest. After this, the day could begin. In families with multiple dreamers, blank nights were sometimes synchronized. If 2 or more people had suffered restless dreams for many nights in a row, an elder might declare a shared blank night. The hearth would be left unlit or covered in ash. Beds were made simply, without herbs or charms, and the household would breathe together in silence before sleep, a subtle kind of harmony that needed no melody. Some even kept a blank stone near the entrance of their home, a smooth, pale stone with no markings. On nights of deep exhaustion or emotional weight, they would touch this stone once before entering, signaling their intent to sleep without dreaming. Over years, these stones became polished by the oil of hundreds of fingertips, a silent history of chosen rest. Among the more philosophical elders, it was said that blank nights were the soul's way of washing its own hands, of stepping back from the endless stories just for a while to remember how it feels to simply be. Because even in a world of dreamwalkers, spirit lullabies, and prophetic herbs, the deepest form of healing was sometimes nothing. Nothing but the soft sound of breath, the weight of a warm blanket, and the gentle reassurance that no visions would arrive tonight. And in that blankness, a different kind of peace was found. Sleep, for the early Slavs, was never truly private. Not because others watched, nor because dreams were shared aloud, but because the space itself, the very room in which one lay, was believed to be a participant in the ritual. And in many homes, that space was shaped not only by wood and thatch, but by the unseen presence of the domovoi. The domovoi, a quiet and ever-watchful house spirit, was thought to live near the hearth or beneath the threshold. He was neither ghost nor god, but something older in ancient essence of place, born from the home's foundation and the first breath of smoke from the original fire. It was believed that he kept the household safe, especially during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Each night before lying down, many families performed a small act of reverence for the domovoi. A crumb left near the stove, a splash of milk on the floorboards, or simply a whispered word, "Stay with us." The ritual varied, but the intent was always the same: an invitation for the domovoi to guard the sleepers until morning. Though invisible to most, his presence was known by certain signs: an extra creak in the floor at midnight, the fire flaring without reason, or the feeling of a light weight pressing at the foot of the bed. These were not feared. They were welcomed. It meant he was watching. One curious tradition revolved around the domovoi mood. If he was displeased, it was said that dreams would become restless, full of tangles, of rooms with no doors, of stairs that led nowhere. To soothe him, sleepers might place a pinch of salt under the pillow, or tuck a hair from each family member beneath a corner of the mat, symbolizing unity and peace. But not all gestures were so solemn. In some villages, children would leave tiny shoes made of bark by the hearth playful offerings to encourage the domovoi to patrol the house quietly. If the shoes were gone by morning, it was taken as a sign of good dreams to come. Sleep placement also mattered. It was customary for the eldest in the household to sleep nearest the hearth, the symbolic heart of the home. The domovoi, too, was thought to prefer this space, and proximity to him brought better sleep. Newcomers to the home, whether guests or new spouses, would not sleep near the fire until they had greeted the house, usually by touching the central beam and speaking a phrase of respect. In some homes, this beam called the svechnik was adorned with symbols or feathers, meant to please the spirit and keep him curious, rather than bored or grumpy. A bored domovoi, according to old sayings, would braid the horses' manes or knock pots over just to pass the time. One gentle, if odd, custom involved the sleep song for the house. Before bed, one member of the family, often a grandparent, would hum a tuneless melody near the center of the room. The song had no words and no set rhythm. It was meant not for people, but for the house itself, to lull its walls and beams into rest. In homes where this ritual was kept, creaks and groans were fewer, and children claimed they never dreamed of falling. Domovoi were especially active during nights of change a baby's first sleep, a returning traveler's rest, the eve of a wedding. On such nights, a bowl of warm water would be left uncovered by the stove. If the water grew cloudy by morning, it was a sign the domovoi had accepted the change. If it remained clear, something more was needed, usually a private apology, offered without witnesses. A peculiar tradition persisted in northern territories, where each home had a dream corner. This was a small space, often beside a window or beneath a roof beam, reserved for the domovoi's own sleep. Though he never truly slept, it was believed that if you acknowledged his rest by keeping the space undisturbed, no shoes placed there, no broom sweeping it, you would be rewarded with calmer dreams. One folktale told of a man who ignored the dream corner and stored firewood there. That winter, he slept every night with visions of wolves surrounding his bed. When he finally removed the logs and whispered an apology, the wolves disappeared, and his dreams returned to quiet meadows. Despite his watchful nature, the domovoi was also known to warn through dreams. If he sensed danger, illness, betrayal, poor choices, she might send symbolic visions. A crumbling roof, a candle flickering backwards, a mirror that refused to show a face. These dreams weren't always understood, but they left impressions. And when the events came to pass, villagers would say, the domovoi tried to speak. Another curious belief held that the domovoi could borrow dreams. If someone in the house had not dreamed for many nights, it was said that the spirit had taken their dreams to keep for himself, perhaps for warmth, or out of curiosity. To coax the dreams back, the person would leave a sweet bread on the windowsill at dusk and sleep facing the wall, whispering, "You may look, but I must dream." Sometimes it worked, but the relationship was never fearful. The domovoi was a guardian, a memory keeper, a night watchman older than language. To include him in the rituals of rest was not superstition, it was hospitality. Even the way beds were made reflected this understanding. No sharp objects under pillows, no mirrors facing the sleeping mat, no drying herbs hung above the hearth without first asking aloud, "Is this acceptable?" A simple nod toward the ceiling was often enough. And in return, the domovoi offered protection not with weapons or might, but by keeping the fragile strands of sleep intact, by weaving calm through the wood grain and the mortar, by keeping nightmares outside the walls. In the hush of night, when only the stars blinked and the fire's breath slowed to a whisper, the house itself slept. Not empty, not alone. Watched, held. And in the corner near the hearth, where no one ever stepped barefoot, the domovoi listened. Winter changed everything. When the snow came layer upon layer of it, thick enough to muffle footsteps and bend branches, the world itself seemed to slow. Time stretched, sounds softened. And within this cold stillness, the sleep rituals of the Slavic tribes shifted into something deeper, older, and more communal. They called this season Zimski Son, the winter sleep. It was not merely sleep during winter nights. It was a way of entering rest that mirrored the land's own slumber. People slept longer, woke slower, and dreamed more vividly. Even the rhythms of the day bent to accommodate this hibernation-like state. Tasks were done gently, movements reduced, voices kept low. The home became a cocoon. Unlike the blank nights of summer or the dream-walking of spring, the winter sleep was collective. Entire households moved together into this softened rhythm. Fires were stoked with care, not only for warmth but to maintain the heartbeat of the space. Beds were layered with furs, reeds, and woven mats, forming wide, shared sleeping areas, sometimes big enough for 5 or 6 bodies. In such closeness, dreams didn't remain individual. It was believed that during Zimski Sun, dreams could overlap. A mother and child might both see a white stag in their sleep, or 2 brothers might wake recalling the same storm over a distant sea. This was not alarming, it was expected. Winter, after all, was the season of threads of weaving, of knitting, of connections hidden and strong. To prepare for this communal dreaming, homes had special rituals. One involved smudging the beams, burning dried spruce needles and waving the smoke into the roof's corners while chanting a protective verse. Another involved story coats-long, blanket-like garments embroidered with symbolic scenes, which were worn to bed and believed to guide dreams toward warmth, memory, and safety. The elders, as always, played a central role. They were the keepers of Zimski Pesny winter songs, not carols, not chants, but slow, meandering melodies sung before sleep. Some were wordless. Others carried whispers of old stories, of frost spirits, of snow wolves who carried dreams in their fur, of a sleeping earth that hummed beneath the ice. These songs were not meant to entertain. They were meant to lull, to guide the body toward stillness and ease the mind into surrender. One curious belief during winter sleep was the presence of watchers. It was said that the cold brought clarity to the veil between worlds. Spirits of the forest, ancestors long gone, or nameless figures made of shadow and starlight might hover near the walls, watching with curiosity. To acknowledge them gently, respectfully, was thought to ensure peaceful dreams. A whispered, "I see you," said just once before sleep, was enough. A stranger custom, still practiced in some northern tribes, was the ice mirror. At night, a shallow dish of water would be left outside to freeze. In the morning, the frozen surface was examined for patterns, bubbles, cracks, or frost lines. These were believed to reflect the collective dream of the household. If the pattern formed a spiral, it meant harmony. If it fractured, a ritual of smoke and ash was performed to realign the dreams. Firelight became sacred during Zimski Sun, not just for warmth, but as a beacon for the dreaming spirit. Some sleepers placed a small candle in a clay lantern beside their bed, believing that its glow helped guide their soul home if it wandered too far during the night. The candle was never blown out. Instead, it was allowed to fade on its own, a symbolic closing of the dream door. Food played a role, too. The evening meal before winter sleep was heavier, starchier, and always included something round-boiled dumplings, oatcakes, or roasted turnips. Circles represented completeness, and it was thought that eating such shapes helped close the body for rest. In some homes, bits of these meals were offered to the hearth as thanks to the domovoi and to winter itself. Even animals took part. Cows were brushed slowly before dusk, with lullabies hummed into their ears. Dogs were given pieces of fur to curl against. And in more than a few stories, cats were said to guard dreams, sitting alert at the edge of the sleeping mat, staring into spaces no human could see. If the cat remained calm through the night, the household's dreams would be peaceful. Despite the depth of this sleep, waking during Zimski Sun was not discouraged. But it had to be done gently. Those who woke early would sit near the fire and wait for the others, not speaking, just listening. Sometimes they would write a single symbol into the ashes with a stick, a tree, a star, a circle. Then they would smooth it over before anyone else rose. This private marking was a message to the dream world. I remember. One tale tells of a young boy who woke during a stormy winter night and traced a bird into the hearth's ashes. That morning, the village awoke to find a white raven perched on the roof, unmoving, silent, watching. By nightfall, the storm had cleared. It was said that the raven was a dream that had stepped outside. In the deepest part of winter, during the week when the sun barely rose, families practiced mirror fasting. All reflective surfaces, metal bowls, still water, bits of polished glass were covered. It was believed that to see one's own face during this sleep would confuse the spirit, make it forget its place. And so the world was dimmed, made simpler, calmer. At the end of the season, when the snow began to recede and the days stretched longer, a final sleep was taken. The last winter night, it was called. Families would lie together in silence. No songs, no herbs, just shared breath and warmth. And in the morning, as the fire was stoked anew, someone, usually the oldest, would say the words that closed the season. Enough now. The earth is waking. As spring crept over the land first through the soft cracking of ice on riverbanks, then in the shy blooming of white snowdrops near forest paths, so too did the Slavs' sleep rituals begin to stir, shedding the heaviness of winter in favor of light, movement, and renewal. This seasonal shift brought with it a unique tradition, sun obmivani, the dream washing. Sleep, in the cold months, was inward and still heavy like buried roots. But spring demanded freshness, and with it came the need to clean one's sleep. The idea wasn't just metaphorical. It involved physical acts, performed with care and intention, to refresh the body and soul's relationship with dreams. Dream washing began at dawn on the first warm morning when dew clung visibly to leaves and rooftops. Sleepers would rise before the sun crested fully over the horizon and walk barefoot into the misty fields or wood edges. There they would gather dew with their fingers, using it to gently pat their faces, their chests, their temples. This was believed to clear away lingering dream fragments from the cold season, especially those that felt heavy or unfinished. In river villages, more elaborate rituals were practiced. One involved filling a clay bowl with river water, letting it sit beneath moonlight, then washing the feet with it just before sleep. This act symbolized stepping away from the past season's dreams, allowing new visions to enter with the warming earth. Younger members of the community often participated with enthusiasm. Children would race to find the clearest dew, or try to gather enough drops to fill a walnut shell. In some villages, it was considered good luck if you could catch morning dew using only a strand of your own hair, then flick it toward the sky without it falling. But sun obmivani was more than dew and water, it was a mindset. Spring dreams were said to be rootless. Unlike winter dreams, which clung to memory and family and the house spirit, spring dreams came fast and wild. They might involve flying, falling, meeting strangers who smiled without reason. They were ungrounded, unpredictable, and often brief but deeply felt. To navigate this volatility, some families used dream weights. These were small pouches filled with dried lavender, crushed willow bark, and tiny pebbles from riverbeds. Tied with string and worn around the wrist or tucked under the pillow, these weights were believed to keep the sleeper from lifting off, anchoring their dreams just enough to bring them back in memory. There were also dream nets, delicate webs of string tied between bedposts or across windows, decorated with feathers, snail shells, or beads. Not unlike later dream catchers of other cultures, these nets were meant not to trap nightmares, but to slow down dreams, giving the sleeper more time to engage with them. During the spring weeks, dreams became more social. It was common for friends, siblings, or even entire households to sit quietly at breakfast and simply nod when someone mentioned a dream image they had also seen. A white hare, a cracking egg, a stairway of water. These shared symbols were not investigated too deeply. They were considered gentle echoes, signs that the sleepers had brushed past each other in the dream world, like fireflies blinking in sync. A more mysterious practice during spring was the voice dream ritual. On the first new moon after thaw, certain elders or sensitive sleepers were said to receive dreams not in images, but in sounds, whispers, songs, even single spoken words. These voice dreams were rare and often disorienting. The person would wake with a ringing in the ears, a feeling of having been spoken to by the forest itself. To soothe this and make sense of it, the dreamer would lie in the grass alone for a full hour the next morning, eyes closed, letting the sound reform in their thoughts. Only after that hour could they share the word never before. Some kept small clay tiles beside their beds for this purpose. If a word came in the night, they would scratch it into the tile with a bone stylus, then leave it in a tree's hollow for the wind to decide its fate. If the tile was gone by morning, it was a good omen. If it remained, the word was to be kept silent for 7 nights. Spring also reawakened the practice of dream planting. A sleeper would whisper a wish or question into a handful of seed, usually barley, poppy, or dill, then place them under the pillow for one night. In the morning, they would plant the seeds in a quiet patch of soil and wait. If the seeds grew well, it meant the dream would come true or the question had an answer on its way. This ritual was especially common among those seeking change, a woman hoping for a child, a young man preparing to leave home, an elder sensing the end of a long journey. The seeds weren't magic, they were messengers. Spring dreams were often lighter in tone but not without strangeness. One recurring symbol in oral tradition was the turning tree, a massive oak or pine that slowly rotated in the dream, showing different seasons or faces with each turn. Another was the silent child, who appeared in many dreams across different regions, always watching, never speaking, often handing the dreamer a single objectostone, a spoon, a ring of moss. No one could say what these figures meant, and no one tried to. The spring taught patience. It asked dreamers not to interpret, but to carry what they saw like rain in cupped hands, temporary and vital. And when the first thunder rolled across the sky, a signal of true seasonal shift, families would mark the moment by washing their bedding, sweeping the thresholds, and offering a song to the nearest tree. This was known as the dream's release. It was a goodbye to the older dreams, an invitation to whatever came next. So spring did not erase winter's dreams. It loosened them, allowed them to drift upward like mist. And in their place came something freer, harder to name, soft-footed dreams that ran with the deer, fluttered with the willow branches, laughed behind the blooming hedges. Not better, just new. With the arrival of summer, the Slavic approach to sleep entered its most fluid and untamed phasia time, when the boundaries between night and day, dream and waking, softened until they nearly vanished. Summer brought long twilight hours and short velvety nights. The warmth loosened both the limbs and the mind, making sleep a lighter thing, more like drifting than descending. This season's practice was known as plavanie snaith, floating sleep. Where winter sleep had been rooted and deep, summer sleep was mobile, scattered. People did not always sleep through the night, nor did they always sleep indoors. Hammocks woven from willow rope were strung between trees. Blankets were spread in gardens, on rooftops, or beside creeks. Sleep became a wandering act, a meandering pause between adventures. Because of this, rituals during plavanie sna were less formal but no less meaningful. The most common was the leaf pillow. People gathered fresh leaves, birch, elder, or hazelan, tucked them into linen pouches to lay their heads upon. The rustle of leaves beneath the ear was considered soothing, a sound that reminded the sleeper they were part of the living world, held in 1,000 leafy hands. Children loved this custom. They would compete to make the softest leaf pillow, sometimes adding crushed flowers or mint stems to scent the pouch. It was said that dreams born on a leaf pillow would be green, full of meadows, foxes, and laughter. The floating sleep was also associated with napping, a practice not treated as laziness but as wisdom. During the hottest hours, work paused. People slept in bursts an hour beneath a fruit tree, 20 minutes beside a stream. Dreams during these short rests were quick, bright flashes, a face you hadn't seen in years, a horse galloping across a sky made of bread, a bell that echoed without sound. In some regions, especially among shepherds and foragers, the summer brought about the custom of dream trails. These were informal paths walked before sleep, usually alone, through quiet woods or across open fields. The idea was to let the body move slowly while the mind unspooled from the day. These walks weren't about reaching a place, they were about preparing the soul to float. Upon returning, the sleeper would lie down without speaking, and sleep would arrive like a tide. The most fascinating summer practice, however, was the shared dusk. In this ritual, as twilight settled across the land and the sky turned the color of bruised plums, entire families or even neighborhoods would gather outside, seated on logs, blankets, or the earth itself. No one spoke of daily concerns. Instead, they listened to insects, to wind, to each other's breath. Sometimes a story was told, not a loud one, not a frightening one, but something soft. A tale of a river that dreamed of being sky, a fox that forgot its own name, a girl who could hear flowers sigh. These stories were offerings to the night, not meant to stir, only to settle. And as the stars appeared, people would gradually slip away, one by one, into their homes or into sleep beneath the open sky. Another summer custom was the water mirror. Each morning, just after waking, sleepers would look into a still surface, usually a bowl of rainwater or the calm face of a pond. The belief was that whatever image lingered in the reflection would tell you how the dream had shaped you. A pale face meant clarity. Blurred edges suggested the dream was still speaking, and if a leaf floated into the water just then, it was said to be the dream itself, trying to return. But dreams in summer weren't always gentle. They were wild, fast, and at times overwhelming. Sleepers described seeing animals too large for the forest, feeling their bodies dissolve into wind, or speaking with people who had no faces. To help ground themselves after such dreams, some practiced the binding a simple ritual of tying a string, thread, or thin reed around the wrist or ankle before bed. In the morning, the string would be untied slowly, with the belief that whatever dream had visited would unravel with it, returning to the world without clinging too tightly. Among older villagers, there was a phrase often whispered at midsummer. "The night runs faster now." It referred to how quickly darkness came and went, how dreams flickered like fireflies, appearing and vanishing before one could grasp them. Sleep during this time was precious not because it was long, but because it was briefly infinite. One tale tells of a woman who slept only 12 minutes on a midsummer night, yet claimed to have lived 3 years in her dream, falling in love, raising a child, watching the sea rise and recede. When she woke, she could still feel the weight of a child in her arms, though she had never borne one. Another tradition, quiet and beautiful, was the echo nap. After working in fields or gathering berries, someone might lie down where another had just rested. The warmth of the spot, the impression in the grass, the shape of another's sleep, was thought to carry traces of the previous dream. To nap there was to receive a gift, a leftover echo from someone else's floating sleep. In communities that embraced plavania sna, the boundaries of self grew soft. Dreams overlapped, stories wove together, identities blurred. People didn't worry about explaining what they saw in their sleep. They simply shared it like fruit bite-sized and sweet, passed from hand to hand. And so, summer became not just a season of light and labor, but of surrender. To the heat, to the breeze, to the brief and vivid flashes of dreams that came and went like sparks from a fire. By the time the shadows grew longer again, and the leaves began to whisper of fall, people had slept in dozens of places beneath stars, beside friends, on stones and in trees, and their dreams had spread like pollen, carried on the wind. Not caught, not caged, just allowed. As the days shortened and the scent of turning leaves filled the air, the early Slavic tribes entered a season of transition. Autumn, called Osenia in many dialects, was a time of harvest, reflection, and quiet preparation, not just for the earth, but for the soul. And with it came a unique approach to rest the sleep of remembering. This was a time when dreams turned inward again. After the free-floating visions of summer, autumn dreams were slower, deeper, and filled with the presence of those who had come before. It was believed that during this season, the barrier between the living and the dead thinned not sharply, not hauntingly, but gently, like morning mist softening the world. And so, the Slavs developed a way to honor the past while sleeping. They called it spomeni son, the memory sleep. The ritual began with gathering breath. Each night before bedding down, sleepers would take 3 deliberate, quiet breaths while touching a chosen object from their family's history: a carved spoon, a scrap of cloth, a stone from a grandmother's path. This object wasn't meant to summon spirits. It served as an anchor, a reminder that the sleeper was part of a story that extended far behind them. Some placed the object beneath the pillow, others simply held it for a moment and returned it to a shelf. What mattered was the intention to sleep in remembrance. Dreams during spomeni sun were often filled with old voices, unfamiliar homes, or moments from lives not directly one's own. A girl might dream of weaving with hands much older than hers. A boy might wake with a song in his head that no one had sung in the village for decades. These were not considered strange. They were echoes, welcome ones. To process such dreams, families began the tradition of morning bread. Each morning after a significant dream, the dreamer would break a small loaf of rye or oat bread and offer a piece to someone else, without explanation. It was an act of quiet connection, a way of sharing what could not be said. The belief was that even without details, the emotion of the dream passed through the bread. Certain nights in autumn were especially sacred for sleep. The first full moon after equinox was known as Vechnaya Noc, the eternal night. On this night, sleep was not interrupted. No fires were fed, no water drawn, no words spoken after sundown. Entire villages would go to bed as if laying down a single body, resting together in silence. It was believed that ancestors came close on this night not to frighten, but to walk among their own. The dreams of Vechnaya Noc were rarely remembered in detail. They left behind feelings instead: safety, longing, sometimes quiet tears with no known origin. If a dream was recalled clearly, the dreamer was not to speak of it until the following sunset. Let it settle, the elders would say. Let the dream decide if it wants to remain. A unique tradition emerged in forest villages' leaf beds. On clear, dry autumn nights, people would sleep directly on beds of leaves, carefully arranged maple, oak, and beech, believing that the crunch and scent of the leaves would draw out dreams of past seasons, both lived and inherited. Lying on rustling leaves, one could sometimes feel the weight of stories pressing gently from below. It was during this time that the name whispers began. In the moments just before sleep, a person would quietly speak aloud the name of someone they had loved and lost. Not expecting a visit, not asking for one, only acknowledging them. This simple act was thought to open a small door, just wide enough for memory to pass through. And sometimes in dreams, that person would appear, not as a ghost, but as they had been in some joyful moment. Feeding chickens, mending clothes, humming. These dreams didn't stir fear. They brought warmth, a sense of circular time, as if death itself had paused for a while to let old love be felt once more. Another ritual of the autumn season was the candle trace. Before sleeping, one would light a small beeswax candle and let it burn just long enough to soften the shadows on the wall. While watching the flickering light, the dreamer would reflect on a single memory, not a grand one, but something quiet: the sound of boots on gravel, the smell of a certain soup, the way a sister's braid curled in the rain. The candle was then extinguished with a whisper, and the dreamer would lie down with the memory still in mind, allowing it to drift into their dreams like a leaf falling onto water. Among the elders, one practice was especially cherished: the remembering song. This wasn't sung aloud, but hummed deep in the chest, just loud enough for the dreamer to feel the vibration. The tune was simple, usually passed down from a parent or grandparent, and it was believed to guide the soul toward meaningful dreams. If the melody matched one remembered from childhood, the sleeper was said to rest deeper, as if cradled by the past. During harvest festivals, dreams were taken more seriously than ever. Those who dreamed of a poor crop or a rotting storehouse were given tasks of preparation, checking root cellars, inspecting the grain. A dream of overflowing baskets or fat geese, on the other hand, was celebrated, and the dreamer might be gifted a new scarf, a ring of dried apples, or a place of honor at the next communal meal. Finally, as the season edged toward winter, a ritual called the winding down took place. Dreamers would begin to taper their interactions with intense dreams. Fewer herbs under pillows, less dream sharing over meals. This was not rejection, it was rest. Just as the earth prepared to sleep under snow, so did the dreaming mind prepare to return to the hearth and the domovoi, to the thick blankets and steady firelight of the cold months. And so, autumn passed not in fiery farewells, but in gentle acknowledgments of what had been, of who had gone, of the long branching story that each sleeper carried inside their chest, unfolding each night with the fall of the leaves. As the wheel of the year circled back toward winter, and the air began once again to bite at the edges of sleeves and scarves, the early Slavs entered their final sleep ritual cyclione that did not mark a season, but rather a threshold. This was the ritual known as Noc Predala, or the Night of Crossing. Unlike the other sleep practices tied to weather or agricultural rhythms, Noc Predala was personal. It came when it needed to, sometimes once a year, sometimes once in a lifetime. It was not dictated by moon or harvest, but by the heart, and when it arrived, the sleeper knew. The signs were quiet but unmistakable, a restlessness that no herb could ease, a dream that circled itself like a snake biting its own tail, a sudden memory of something not yet lived, or perhaps a soft pull at the edge of consciousness, as though a voice were calling not to wake, but to go deeper. When this feeling came, one was to prepare for the night of crossing. Preparations were simple, ceremonial. The bed was remade with clean linens, no symbols or herbs. A single glass of water was placed at the bedside, nothing else. No charms, no fire, no words. Sleepers would often fast that day, not out of ritual duty, but because the body seemed to ask for it. They walked slowly, if at all. They did not tell others. This was a solitary thing, and when night came, they lay down in complete darkness. No candles, no moonlight if it could be helped. Eyes closed, they would breathe in a measured rhythm, often counting heartbeats until numbers blurred. What happened during Noc Predella was never the same for any two people. Some dreamed of standing at a shoreline with no sea. Others wandered endless forests filled with mirrors or staircases that descended into roots. Some met figures who spoke in languages they couldn't understand, yet somehow remembered. Some dreamed nothing at all, just the sensation of being unwrapped, peeled back to something more essential. The dream was not the goal, the crossing was. And the Slavs believed that when one returned from this night, if they returned, they were different. They had shed something, a weight, a fear, a question they hadn't known they were asking. There was no ceremony the morning after, no breakfast shared or tales exchanged. In fact, it was customary to spend that day in silence. The sleeper would often take a slow walk through the woods or sit near a body of water. They did not touch others. They barely looked them in the eye. Only after 3 sunrises would they speak again. Those who had crossed, especially elders, were often recognized by their stillness. Not the weariness of age, but the calm of someone who had been on the other side of something vast. They no longer hurried. Their dreams became gentler, fewer, but more vivid when they came. They no longer feared sleep. One peculiar belief held that animals recognized those who had crossed. Dogs would sit closer. Birds would land on nearby branches. Even insects seemed to avoid biting them. It was said the natural world respected the threshold traveler. Some sleepers had to wait many years for their crossing. They might feel the pull in their youth, but resist it. Others would attempt the ritual too early and wake unchanged, unsure of what they sought. Elders advised patience. The crossing, they said, came only when it was time when the spirit was ripe for molting. Rarely, someone would cross more than once. These people were often marked literally, a mole that changed shape, a line appearing overnight on the palm. One man was said to have spoken a new word in a forgotten dialect after his second crossing, and though he never remembered the dream itself, the word stayed with him for the rest of his life. He carved it into every door he ever made. A soft word, something close to peace, but deeper. Noc Predella was the closing of the dreaming year, but also its renewal. After this crossing, all other sleep rituals returned with greater meaning. Blank nights became sacred. Shared dreams were seen as blessings. Even a nap beneath a birch tree carried more weight. And so the cycle turned. The Slavs never wrote down these practices. There were no tomes, no scriptures, only memory. Only stories whispered in low tones. Only the knowing in one's bones when a night felt different. The night of crossing was not about death. It was about shedding what wasn't truly living. About stepping beyond the veil, not to disappear, but to come back more whole, to dream differently, to rest more deeply, to listen finally to the quiet voice beneath all other voices, the one that had always been there, waiting. And now, as the final thread of the tale is gently tucked into place, let the hush of the story settle like soft snow upon your thoughts. You've wandered far tonight through forests heavy with memory, across moonlit meadows where children whispered to spirits, past hearths that glowed with warmth older than language itself. You've heard the rustle of leaf pillows beneath dreamers' heads, tasted the silence of eternal night, and glimpsed the strange flicker of a Domovois shadow just beyond the corner of vision. Each season brought its own sleep, its own rhythm, its own way of holding the soul. Winter cradled it in firelight and stillness. Spring loosened it like dew from grass tips. Summer set it adrift on warm breezes and starlit hammocks. Autumn brought it home to memory, to name, to story. And beyond them all, there was the night of crossing quiet, waiting, sacred. Now, wherever you are, whether the wind taps at your window or the silence of your room is deep and undisturbed, You too carry some part of this old rhythm, perhaps in the way your body curls into rest, or in the dreams that will soon arrive, gentle, slow, threaded with mist and wonder. Let them come. Let the pulse of the earth's old lullabies carry you down. Let the echoes of leaf and fire and breath rock you gently. Let your thoughts float like pollen, like ash, like the quiet sigh of ancestors watching with kind eyes from the other side of sleep. There is nothing left to do now. No need to remember every word. Just let the rhythm stay. Let the warmth linger. And rest. Good night.